Buddhaya. Good evening. Welcome to the Buddha Dharma TV. I am Agnes Gay. Today, let us begin our program with a Buddhist song. It is Buddha Soldiers by Wayfarers. Next up, we have an insightful talk titled Understanding the Nature of Fear. It is a psychology-focused presentation by the esteemed Venerable Covida from Canada.
Now, basically, there are two kinds of fear. There's physical fear and mental, psychological fear. Now, physical fear is something that is more easy to understand because it's a part of our instinctive animal behavior. And when we're young, our parents or elders have to teach us the dangers of the physical dangers that we can experience. Just like young animals have to be taught the physical dangers of the environment. But once we learn physical dangers and we become more aware, then our natural instinct takes over. And of course, when we we're faced with any type of physical danger, we experience this fear. So it's something quite natural in our human nature. But mental psychological fear is more complex. Because as human beings, we're thinking primates. And as you know, we tend to think too much. Although we need to think in daily life, we have to use our memory, our knowledge, our expertise. But you find that even when we don't need to think, the mind keeps thinking unnecessarily. So, because thinking becomes very compulsive. It's a very compulsive habit in human consciousness. And because we're not taught to understand the nature of thinking, when we're in school and we're not taught about the benefits of mindfulness and mindfulness practice, we think that we think and believe that we have to be thinking all the time. And so we identify very strongly with our thinking process, our mental formations. And that includes, our ideas, views, and opinions. And we tend to worship knowledge, book knowledge, academic knowledge. And that's why, in the end, most of us suffer from neurosis to varying degrees. Neurosis is when we identify totally with thinking, and every time we use the word I, which is a social label, we think this I is who we are. And we become very attached to this I. And of course, we experience a lot of fear, a lot of desires, frustrations, and insecurity, because we try to protect this I. Now, the model I like to use when I'm describing this mental psychological fear is that of a tree. You have the different branches of the tree, which are the different types of mental psychological fears that we have. And we have the connecting trunk of the tree, the connecting factors of fear. And there are three factors that connect all our mental psychological fears. And then there is the root of the tree of fear. So we can explore the different types of mental psychological fears that we have. There's the fear of not being successful, fear of not achieving your goals, the fear of not getting what you want, the fear of being a failure. And in some ways, these fears are connected to the fear of not pleasing your parents and close relatives, family expectations. And there's also the fear of not getting married and having children. The fear of not being loved and accepted. There's the fear of being judged and criticized. The praise and blame. There's also the fear of loss. And the fear of change. There's also the fear of sickness, aging, and death. And death is a great unknown, the mystery of death. So the fear of the unknown. And there's also the fear of uncertainty and the future, because the future is always uncertain. And this is why mindfulness meditation practice helps us to deal with this uncertainty of life, because it makes our mind more stable, more focused, so we can deal more effectively with uncertainty. There's also the fear of loneliness and isolation. The fear of pain, whether it's physical pain or emotional pain. There's also the fear of public opinion, fear of what people are saying, even thinking about us. There's a fear of authority, and the fear of ghosts and spirits. Interestingly, the fear of authority and the fear of ghosts and spirits have something in common. Just like a few of our other fears. And there's a fear that is associated with guilt, because guilt is an aspect of fear. So we'll discuss this. And for some people, including monastics, there's a fear of not achieving enlightenment, the fear of not becoming an arahant or a bodhisattva. So that, I think, are the main fears we have. And you also have those fears that are not so common, like claustrophobia, the fear of enclosed space. And the opposite of that is the fear of open space. It's a very rare fear, but there are some people in the West, in Western countries, that have this fear. The word for it is called agoraphobia. Agoraphobia. You might have heard of it, where people are afraid of open space. They're afraid of going outside, so they remain trapped inside their homes. And you also have those childhood fears, the fear of insects and mice and rats, fear of lizards, fear of snakes. A few people are afraid of animal fur, and some people are afraid of feathers, bird feathers. all types of these fears. But most of these fears begin in childhood. They begin in childhood. A lot of our fears actually start in childhood. Including the fear of ghosts and spirits, right? Because you're told when you're young, don't go outside at night, because the spirits are outside. So you imagine these spirits. Because where I grew up, we had a lot of African influence. So I was told about African ghosts and spirits. And I really believe them. And I used to imagine them also. Because when you're young, you have a very vivid imagination. And you think it's real. But only later I began to realize it's just the power of the imagination. But with mindfulness, you're able to overcome it. Now, the fear of not being successful, of not achieving your goals, basically the fear of not getting what you want, I think it's related to two things. One is family pressure, especially if your parents have a high expectation of you. And the other cause for this, I believe, is our conditioned habit of comparing ourselves to others. Because when we compare ourselves to others, most of the time we feel inferior. We're not as good as other people. I'm not as successful. I'm not as wealthy. I'm not as popular. So naturally that causes the craving. The craving to become. You want to be as successful as other people. And it can be family members, like say siblings. It can be friends. It can be relatives. It can be co-workers, and so on. And with that, of course, is the fear of not pleasing your parents and your close relatives, especially if they have high expectations of you. So naturally, it creates more anxiety in the mind. I'd like to tell the story of a student I once met at a Dharma camp many years ago in Malaysia. And he was a very bright student, not only academically, but he was very intelligent. And he was telling me that every time he had to study for a test or an exam, he was very nervous. So I said, why? You're a very good student. He said, the problem is not me, it's my parents. They're both school teachers, and he was always top of his class from elementary school days. So you can imagine his parents were very proud of him, and they like to boast. My son is always number one. And it just so happened that the last 2 years, he happened for the first time to come second, and 1 year he came third. And his parents were very displeased, even though he still had, A plus grades. But the parents never saw the grades. My son has to be number one. And these were teachers, so you think they would know better, but they didn't. Very ignorant and immature behavior, because it was all ego, always their ego involved. So I said to him, I would really like to meet your parents, and I want to give them a very good scolding, because I can be very direct. He was a little nervous, and he said, "It's okay, Bante, thank you, but I'll speak to them myself." I said, "Don't worry, I don't live in Malaysia. I can scold them and then leave the country." But it shows you that, even school teachers can be very ignorant and very immature. Because maturity, unfortunately, doesn't necessarily come with age, right? You can still be in your 50s, 60s, 70s, and still be immature. Meaning you still have a strong attachment to ego, to self. And you still think that you're the center of the world and the universe. So as I said, this fear has a lot to do with family expectations and the habit of comparing yourself to others. Interestingly, occasionally someone will feel superior to others when they compare themselves. Most people will feel inferior. But occasionally somebody will feel superior. And they're very proud. And what is interesting, that the person who feels superior, behind that superiority complex is fear. It's insecurity. Just like people who have a aggressive type of behavior, behind that aggression is always fear. Because if you don't have fear, there is no need to be aggressive. There's no need to be competitive. So people who are very competitive, they're very anxious people. And sometimes externally, they might not seem that anxious, but behind it, there is anxiety. There's insecurity there. Very interesting. And again, the fear of getting married, of not getting married and having children, that comes usually from family expectations. And sometimes you get it from peer pressure, from your friends, maybe your other siblings. If they are married and you're not married. It's always interesting, when I used to go to weddings. This was before I became a monk. And of course, when you're single, and you pass a certain age, everybody at the wedding is wondering, when are you going to get married? The saying, monkey see, monkey do. That's right. So one of the lines I used to give people is, I don't want to make anyone unhappy, miserable. So I'd rather be single, out of compassion. Because the truth is, marriage is not for everyone, right? And when you look at the high divorce rate, that is obvious. Marriage is just not for everyone. And part of it too is the fear of loneliness, fear of isolation. And sometimes people will tell you that you might be happy being single, but what happens to you in old age? Who's going to take care of you? Of course, the future is uncertain. You know, you might not live to old age, right? But you see, the mind likes to project, right? Likes to project in the future. Because that's the nature of thinking. Thinking is always moving in time from past to future, past to future. And thinking is related to memory, to past experience and to knowledge, information. You can observe that in your mind. Knowledge, past experience, information, memory. And as you know, when we have unpleasant memories, those unpleasant memories can seem very, very solid, very permanent, especially when there are emotions involved. Because as you know, you can remember something that happened a few years previously, and you can still get upset, right? Or you still have regret, you can still feel guilty about something you did. And the reason why guilt is an aspect of fear is because we tend to create a negative image of ourselves. When we've made a mistake and we start feeling guilty, we tend to create a negative image of ourselves. You know, I'm so terrible, I'm stupid, I'm bad, I'm awful. Why did I do that? Why did I make that mistake? Or why did I say certain things? So having that negative image creates conflict and fear in the mind, plus the other judgmental thoughts. Now, it is natural to have regrets. We can all relate to that. But if we keep having regrets and feeling guilty, then we end up torturing ourselves. You create a lot of conflict in the mind. So this is why it's important when we make mistakes, we have to forgive ourselves for being human. Because as human beings, we are not perfect. And everyone makes mistakes. Everyone. Monks included. Because monks are human beings too. Just like if you happen to have a conflict with somebody, we tend to create a negative image of that person, right? Whereas if you don't have a conflict with anyone, we tend to have a positive image of them. If you've always had pleasant experiences with them. But when we have a conflict with somebody, and it can be anyone, you know, it can be a family member, your partner, a close friend, a co-worker, your neighbor, and so on, then we tend to create this negative image of that person. It's just the way the mind works, because it's based on memory. So this is why the practice of loving kindness is very beneficial when we're suffering from guilt and we have this negative image of ourselves. Because when we do loving kindness meditation, we replace those negative, judgmental thoughts with kind, positive thoughts. May I be well, happy, and peaceful. May I be free from fear, conflict, and delusion. May all beings be well, happy, and peaceful. May all beings be free from fear, conflict, and delusion. And of course, we try to learn from our mistakes. Very important. So a good question to always ask ourselves is, what can I learn from this experience? Instead of blaming yourself or blaming others for the way you feel, a very wise attitude is to ask yourself, what can I learn from this? Now, the fear of loss has to do with dependency. And there are two types of dependency: physical dependency and emotional dependency. Now, as human beings, we have to depend on each other quite often. That's physical dependency. We can help each other. Just like we have to depend on people to do things. But when we become emotionally dependent, then it's something more complicated. Because from that emotional dependency comes a strong attachment, emotional attachment. And with emotional attachment comes the fear of loss. Whether it's regarding people or material things. So this is why we have to ask ourselves, why do we become emotionally dependent on others or on certain material things? And that is because we're looking outside of ourselves, which is a part of our conditioning. And so this is why Dhamma practice is so beneficial, because you're going within yourself and finding that understanding, that wisdom, and that peace, that sense of peace. Because part of our social conditioning is to look outside of ourselves and to react. That's the way we're educated, our social conditioning. Our minds, our brains have been educated to react. First we label things, because we need labels to communicate, and then we judge. We criticize, we compare, sometimes we condemn, and then we like or not like, want, not want, and then to have aversion and ill will, which includes, resentment, hatred, jealousy, envy, and so on. Now, from the Dhamma perspective, we're all deluded by our reactions. But initially, we don't see it as delusion. Why? Because we all do it. We think this is normal social behavior. And it seems that way. And this is why the Buddha, who was so radical and so rational, he said, stop reacting. When you see, just see. When you hear, just hear. It's a very radical advice. It sounds simple, but as you know, it's very difficult to practice. Because we're all conditioned, right, from childhood, to be always reacting. And as I said, we think this is normal behavior. But when we begin to practice, to bring more mindfulness in our daily life, we begin to see that our habitual reactions is what creates our mental, emotional reality. We are creating our own mental, emotional reality. And it's often being said that life is really 10% of things happening and 90% of us reacting to it. And we think our mental emotional reality is, we think it's real and we think it's important and we think it's permanent. But actually it's not. It's often a source of not only conflict, some form of suffering, but also delusion. We are deluded by our mental, emotional reactions. Again, the Buddha's advice was, when you see, just see. When you hear, just hear. Very radical teaching. And he also continued by saying, when you think, just think, and when you know, just know. What that means is that when we need to think, we think logically, rationally, and when we don't need to think, the mind can be quiet. We come back to present moment awareness. So we don't have to be thinking all the time. There's order in the mind. So with this, with mind training and understanding, we can go between thinking and awareness. We move between the conditioned mind and the unconditioned mind. That is order, that's wisdom, that is intelligence. Because as you know, thinking can become very irrational, all right? Very illogical and very negative. And it becomes very illogical, very irrational when it becomes obsessive, all right? Like worrying is a good example of it. And you're thinking, oh, you know, this might happen and that might happen and this might happen and that might happen, right? There's a fear, the anxiety that's created by worrying. And as you know, for some people, it's a habit. There's some people who have this habit of worrying. And if you tell that person that it's a waste of time and you don't have to be worrying, that person will give you many reasons why I must worry. right? They will give you, 1,001 reasons why I must worry. Just like when you're anxious, you have that compulsion, I must check my messages, right, on my phone. And that's why the addiction is so strong to this smartphone technology. Because with that anxiety, you think that if I don't check my messages, somehow the world is going to come to an end. Of course, it never does, but you think that way because of the anxiety. I see this very clearly in Singapore. Because, they're already very anxious, very impatient, and the smartphone technology is making them even more anxious and more impatient. This is why if you ever go on a retreat, you have to hand in your phone, right? And part of the practice, especially the first 3 days, is to observe that strong craving to check your phone. Of course, if there's a family emergency, that's another matter, right? But as you know, most of our messages are not really that emergent, not that important. But we just believe it is because of the anxiety. Now, the fear of change, this has to do with not understanding that we exist, we're alive because of change. And one of the Dhamma practices is to see this clearly. Because when you're busy, you don't see this. For example, if I told you that you're a process of body and mind, physical and mental phenomena, it's just an idea. But if you apply mindfulness, present moment awareness, you begin to see this more clearly. For example, say if you're breathing mindfully, the physical sensation of the breath, just feel the body breathing. That's the physical process, the physical phenomena. And the awareness of the body breathing is mind, the mental process. Again, the physical sensation of breathing is the body, and the awareness of the body breathing is the mind. So you see that there is physical and mental process. Now, when you're doing mindful, say you're walking, or any mindful movement, you can see this more clearly initially. For example, say if you're walking mindfully, your feet moving and stepping is the body, the physical process. And the awareness of the body moving, of the legs moving and stepping, that is the mind. So you see that there is the physical and the mental process. So you can do this as a reflection. Every time you do mindful breathing or mindful walking, just reflect on the body and the mind, the physical and the mental, rupa and nama. And we're alive because we're this process. And it's a very complex process. And because we're a process, we have to keep recharging this process in the same way that you recharge your cell phones. And I mentioned before that even the process of digestion is very, very complex. But most of the time, we don't have to worry about it, unless you're having digestion problem. But if you're fairly healthy, the body has this intelligence to take care of this complexity. So when we do this reflection, then the truth of process, this constant change, becomes clear. It becomes a reality. It's not just an idea. And of course, you're mindful, you see all our sense experiences, all our sense perceptions and memory, the ability to recognize things. You can see it's always changing. What we see, what we hear, what we taste, what we smell, what we feel by touch, and of course what we think. We can see the truth of change, of process. And because we're this constantly changing process of body and mind, this is why all our experiences are impermanent. Whether it's mental, emotional, or physical. So when we have a deeper understanding of process and constantly changing, then we have less fear of change. And now the fear of loneliness and isolation. This comes from not only thinking too much, but we're thinking too much about ourselves. When we're too self-centered, we tend to experience this fear of loneliness and isolation. Because when the mind is agitated, we tend to crave some form of outside stimulation, including company. You know, we crave company. And you begin to see that there's a difference between aloneness and loneliness. Because our basic nature is aloneness. As the saying goes, we're born alone and we die alone. And if you're hungry, no one can eat for you, right? It's like if you're tired, no one can rest for you. If you have to go to the washroom, no one can go for you, right? These are basic facts of life. And of course, when we're calm, we can appreciate being alone. We can accept aloneness. Of course, sometimes it's good to have company also, to interact with other people, but it's also good to be alone. And just to enjoy that peace and quietness. But when the mind is very agitated, then naturally craving arises. And so we suffer from loneliness and isolation. And this is why also the practice of loving kindness can also be beneficial in overcoming this fear of loneliness and isolation. Because we start sending loving kindness to ourselves, then to family, then to friends, to co-workers, to neighbors, and then to all beings. Send loving kindness to all beings. So by doing that, you go beyond the narrow space of the self, the me center. So we can overcome that fear of loneliness and isolation. Now, the fear of pain whether it's physical pain or emotional pain, that has to do with memory. Because say if you've experienced physical pain or emotional pain, when we remember that experience, naturally we don't want to repeat that painful experience, right? So there's a fear of pain, whether it's physical pain or emotional pain. Whereas if we experience something very pleasurable, the opposite happens. Although we cannot cling to a pleasurable experience or a happy feeling, but the mind holds on to it as memory, right? Because we have this thing called memory. So when we remember this pleasurable experience, we naturally want to repeat it. Whereas when we remember something painful, either physical pain or emotional pain, we don't want to repeat it because it's very unpleasant. Hence the fear of pain and the craving for more pleasure. Now, the fear of authority and the fear of ghosts and spirits, we mentioned there's a connection between the two. Just like some other fears, and it has to do with childhood. It begins in childhood. Say if you've had very strict parents, or one parent is very strict. That's where it begins, the fear of that strict parent or parents. And then you go to school, and then there's a fear of the teacher. And sometimes the fear of the school principal. Because where I grew up in elementary school, all teachers were allowed to beat the students. So you can imagine there was that fear of being hit. But in the high school, which was based on the British system, only the headmaster was allowed to beat you. And then you carry that fear in the work environment. So there's a fear of the boss or the supervisor. And sometimes if you go to a temple and the head monk is a little stern or a little serious, there's a fear of the head monk. So you can see that fear it starts in childhood. The fear of authority. And as we said, the fear of ghosts and spirits, it also comes from childhood. And the power of the imagination. And this is why, when possible, I like to do the cemetery meditation. So people can use mindfulness to overcome this fear. But the imagination is very strong. And I mentioned that before, that there's one experiment that I often do on myself, so I can learn about the power of the imagination. And the experiment I like to do is in the evening. Of course, there's no internet around. And I just say to myself, there's something in the room. There's a presence in the room. And every time I say that, automatically I get shivers and I have goosebumps. And sure enough, I feel a presence, and it's usually right behind me. And it's watching me. I dare you to try that, if you're not too scared. But this is where you test your mindfulness. Because if you're not mindful, you leave the room as quick as possible. You get the hell out of there. Because it's so scary, this thing. But if you apply mindfulness, you can overcome it. But I do it all the time, just so I can see the power of the imagination, how powerful it is. At the moment, I'm staying in this building, and throughout the day and throughout the evening, there are always sounds. All these sounds keep coming up. And of course, if you're not mindful, you think, it's some supernatural force that's creating the sound. But again, that's our reaction is the power of the imagination. How the mind can create all these things. The fear of public opinion. That comes from having an image of ourselves. And whenever we have an image of ourselves, we naturally want to protect that image. And the more attached we are to this image, then we have that fear, the fear of public opinion, what people are saying about me, or even thinking about me. So the question is it possible not to have an image of yourself? Is that possible? And with mindful practice, it is possible. Because you can let go of whatever image the mind creates. And you begin to trust in this present moment awareness, mindfulness. Because you see that this present moment mindfulness, awareness, is really who we are. It's not this I, and it's not the image that we have of ourselves. Of course, it's better to have a positive image than to have a negative image of yourself. But even if you have a positive image of yourself, it still creates a conflict. Because we're always trying to protect this image. But when we realize that the awareness is who we really are, then there's no need for an image. We can let go of that image.
Bahung sahas Mabhinim Mitasayu Dhantan Giri Mekhalang Udita Ghora Sasena Marang Danadi Dhamma Vidina Jitava Munindo Tang Tejasa Bhavatu Te Jaya Mangalani.
Our next segment features Venerable Dr. Chandana as he explained Patama Rohogata Sutta from the sacred text of the Samyutta Nikaya. In this discourse, Venerable Anuruddha, an enlightened monk at the time of the Buddha, explores 4 kinds of mindfulness meditation, both internally and externally, focusing on origin and sensations, and cultivating mastery over perceptions. This is the second part of the captivating series on this sutta by Venerable Dr. Chandana.
If you want to lose your path in the Dhamma, then keep doing that. Because the teacher will not be able to help you. Because you've already lost your path. And you're using landmarks and things, signs and things that are not even true. You might have even convinced yourself that those were it. That's what happens. And the teacher is really going to have to bend over backwards to try to figure out what's happening here. But the teacher cannot go and live with every single one of you for about a week or so to see where you really are at. So now what happened then? You're in a jungle, you're lost. Who's responsible? You are. So, never talk about your experiences. Talk about the Dhamma. That's beautiful. And you talk about the Dhamma no more than once a week. I don't care how close you are. If you're sisters, brothers, I don't care. You don't talk about the Dhamma practice including the Dhamma. Leave it to gestate, allow it to grow. It's a seed. Because that conversation once a week we get from the Arya Savakas, okay? We learned that from Venerable Anuruddha, Kimbila, Nandiya. They would talk once every 5 days. Remember from the other suttas that we covered? Remember? Chula Gosinga Sutta? That means also not be part to so many different meditation groups. Because one meditation is going to be teaching you one thing unless you're keeping your practice the same throughout. Don't keep switching. It's going to mess you up. If you know better, don't do it. If you really want to prolong your time in samsara, go ahead. If you really want to prolong your time in samsara and be confused, despite the fact that you are talking Dhamma, then go ahead and be part of several different Dhamma groups, which is something that's been happening a lot in the world, not just in Asia. People are part of 2, 3 different Dhamma groups around the world. Earlier I was making comments about the 12-step programs, the AA type addiction groups. That's what Dhamma groups have turned into. Oh, I'll go there, I'll go there. What is that really doing? It is taking you away from your own personal practice, from your silence. Keep your mouth shut. Keep your practice to yourself. Let the seed send down its roots. Don't open up the soil and say, oh, is it growing now? Is it like that little child who went and planted some seeds with his grandfather? And then the grandfather shows him the carrots that had grown on the other side of the field. They had planted these, and there was some over there. And he says, my son, my grandson, look, that's how they're going to grow. He says, oh yeah, okay. When? Well, when it's time. The next morning, the grandson goes and starts digging and looking. Where are the carrots? There's got to be carrots. There's got to be the plant, whatever it is. How come it's not growing? So your eagerness to gain something out of the Dhamma, that is the kiss of death to your progress. Despite what you tell yourself. Don't fool yourself. Be honest. That's what I keep telling you. Seclusion is necessary. You need to learn that if you want to go deep. You need to learn to be alone. Not to go and live in a kuti. That's not what I'm saying. You need to be alone with your experiences. And yes, you can talk to your teacher, you can send messages, you can send me an email every 2 weeks or so. That gives me enough time to see and to also gauge where you're at. The bhikkhu meditates while observing whatever mental states arising due to outside causes. So first it was, actually I didn't cover that. He meditates while observing the disappearance of whatever mental states that were taking place within. So when you were restless and all of a sudden you did the relaxed step, smile, came back to metta, and you allowed, and you saw that the mind was restless, and then you thought about passaddhi, and now all of a sudden the mind just drops into this state of tranquility. Now, a person who's practicing vipassana proper, somebody who's practicing satipatthana proper, will look and see, interesting, the mind was restless. Oh, that's sweet. Oh, I can feel the bojjhangas, they just melted into the practice. It's so organic. You're seeing it, you're not attached to it. You're seeing it, you're observing it. It's just like seeing someone enter the room and exit the room. You saw the restlessness, you didn't become a slave to the restlessness, you didn't make it your own. That's, I'm restless, I'm a restless person. No, you didn't do that. Restlessness was observed going out, vanishing. And now tranquility is being observed. And tranquility will also go, perhaps. You're not attached to it. So, the bhikkhu meditates while observing whatever mental states arising due to outside causes. He meditates while observing the disappearance of whatever mental states arising due to outside causes. So, the jolting, the noise, Somebody, if you hear a woman scream or cat scream or somebody, a man or an ambulance or a car shrieks, hits their brake and they slam into, it's going to create a certain mental state in us, unless we're inert, unless we're dead. It's going to do something. So the mind of a practitioner of Satipatthana will be watching all that. Oh, okay, there's the sound. They might even be naturally jolted, but they're still there. They're still watching. Who's coming in? In this case, the door is a representation of the 6 sense doors. In this example, it's the ears. Right? The bhikkhu meditates thus while observing the mental states with keen interest. That's key. Keen interest. You need to be excited. You need to be like... There is not a moment of your dull life, you consider your life dull, let's say, or parts of your day, boring. But there's not a moment that actually is boring. None. Leaving the kitchen, going to your living room. You think that's boring? Oh no. For the person who's observing the 6 sense doors, there's so much to observe. And I'm not even talking about the inside, the inner body, the body. The way your feet move. When I was explaining to you how to walk. Be able to touch the ground in a certain way. That takes a special kind of alertness, you know. You know that. That's what we call sati sampajanya. Full awareness. Full. That's applying yoniso manasikara, in case you're wondering. Even from my living room to the bedroom or to the bathroom or outside, throwing away the garbage, all that, yes. So there's not a dull moment to waste. Also, the bhikkhu meditates while observing the mental states that arise or take place within and those arising due to the outside causes. So that's explanatory because we've seen them before in the others. So if he so wishes, while I meditate thus, may I be able to perceive the repulsive in what is attractive. He is able to do so. The same formula repeats for the Chittanupassana here. So seeing the non-repulsive in what is disgusting and repulsive, and to perceive what is repulsive both in the attractive and the repulsive. So you're training yourself. So in your real life, when you're seeing something, intentionally look at something that you don't like to look at. So I would train my students sometimes to look up images online, and especially if I see them able to, and I check on them, and I see I'm checking in, and slowly I will guide them towards watching a dissection of a human body. But it doesn't start like that. It could be a picture, a 2D picture, maybe black and white first, of a cremation site without a human body in it. There's no smell, nothing. Because you don't want to traumatize the person, even though they've had sati, this and that, because you need to ease the person in. Okay, because the students I'm talking about are lay students. So, despite the level of experience and depth in meditation. So slowly, when I see them ready, I will encourage them to, maybe I might even send them some videos of an autopsy, or a dissection, or bleeding. I know grown men and women who would faint if they saw blood, even their own, growing up. So, such a person is really going to have a hard time. So, the idea is to get the mind, not to shock you, but to get your mind to still learn to be equanimous despite whatever it is that it's seeing. Whether it is a beautiful fjord in Norway that you're looking at, a sunrise, you know, coming up. You're standing at the edge of a cliff and it's like, whoa, this is so beautiful. Or seeing worms coming out of a gut of a dead person, or a vulture in Tibet chewing away at the pieces of a femur, the leg bone, the long leg bone that has been cut into pieces, and they're fighting over it. So how is the mind at that moment? That's what we're talking about. It takes effort, it takes practice, but you don't start from there. That's what I'm trying to say. Easy does it. So sati has to start from you, from your normal surroundings. So further, friend, the bhikkhu meditates while observing the relationships of whatever phenomena that arise or take place within. Here, this is my translation, of course, that I'm going over. What I'm talking about is the Dhammanupassana. One of the mispronounced, mistranslated terms are the Dhammas. This is not Dhamma, capital D in English, the teachings or the doctrine or nature or truth. These are the different or various phenomena. It could be the Four Noble Truths, it could be anicca, it could be the five khandhas, it could be the hindrances. All these are mental objects. But it's not just the objects that you're observant of, but also their relationships. Hindrance is not as powerful on its own. Hindrance becomes a real hindrance when it has a relationship with you. It's bugging you, it's making you doubt your practice, the teacher, the teaching. For example, it's a hindrance. So you need to check the relationship. Not just labeling. That's why I never liked labeling. It's one of the useless things you could do. No self-respecting meditator in today's world is actually going to be teaching labeling. That's outdated. Because it distances the person, the experiencer, from the experience itself. You're labeling it. You're giving it a badge. You're not seeing the truth of it. You're creating another quasi-truth of it. So you can never truly experience vipassana then. There's no satipatthana. You're labeling it. But there's entire schools dedicated to that, unfortunately. He meditates while observing the disappearance of relationships of whatever phenomena that were taking place within. So I gave the example of hindrances. You see the hindrances come, you see them go. Just like the person coming in and out of the room. You're just observing. You're aware. You're not lying to yourself. You're not making up stuff. You're not hiding anything from yourself either. The bhikkhu meditates while observing the relationships of whatever phenomena arising due to outside causes this time. You were sitting comfortably and all of a sudden somebody does something and now there is the hindrance of restlessness. Or somebody in front of your eyes breaks a precept, especially on a retreat, let's say. We're not supposed to eat, and then you see the person looking around and they get an apple and they bite into it. Or they have some food left in the fridge, they pull it out and they start eating the chow mein or whatever food they had, the sandwich, whatever it was. Now, guess what has become your meditation object? Oh, disgusting. Vyapada. How about if it was you who did it? Oh. Remorse come to mind? Guilty? I shouldn't have done that. I shouldn't have done that. Guess what? The mind is now agitated, which is why we keep sila. Sila is because we need to have the mind calm down. To protect your mind. That's the first reason why we practice sila. You don't put yourself in harm's way. So, this is the observing the outside conditions and what they're doing for the Dhammanupassana, so nothing is slipping by you. But this is a level that not everyone has to reach even. Okay? Many times I've had the question of, well, do I need to practice all the satipatthanas to attain, let's say? Honest answer is no. You can attain just from the Kayanupassana if you're practicing truthfully, fully. You're not letting any of your inhale or exhale go to waste. For example, Lord Buddha gave the instructions not just for just one category of people. There are different levels of people, of understanding. So for a mind that is able to penetrate deeper and function on these different levels, such a person, and they practice and they have the time also to do it, they can evolve their practice to practice all the levels of satipatthana. That's fine. But please don't make the mistake to think that, oh, I can only attain if I've reached all the way up to the Dhammanupassana level. Absolute nonsense. That's wrong view. Whoever teaches that, I don't know of anyone who teaches that, by the way. But if you ever heard it, that's absolute complete miccaditthi. Has nothing to do with the Dhamma. Kayanupassana is enough. Vedanupassana on its own is enough. Pick one. Whatever works for you. And it's not like you're going to be stuck with one. Sometimes they change. I would have fun with one versus the other. Sometimes I'm in the mood for just the body. Sometimes the feelings are so loud because it's an intense environment, the outside circumstance, the external world that they're talking about. It's too massive, it's too powerful. So you cannot avoid being surrounded by feelings, heavy feelings, usually one of the two extremes, either really good or really bad. Especially when you're sick or when you get sunburned. This week, I had the unique circumstance, shall we say, of experiencing severe hives. And it started on Sunday night, the orientation night. And it just stopped yesterday. Extreme itching, all from my head down to my toes. Terrible itching. I was sleeping for about maybe an hour and a half, 2, if I was lucky about 3 hours. Painful itching, as if I was telling someone who was, getting me like some antihistamines and things. It felt like countless ants crawling under your skin, eating at you and burning you at the same time. And suddenly it cools and then it changes. The midsection starts and then one leg. What is this going to do to the brain, to the mind? There's a lot of feelings going on, isn't there? Sensations. So not to miss any of these opportunities. And you're also watching the mind. The mind says, well, it's not fair. Now is the time. Like, I have to be there for my students. Now it's the time for this? Now? On 10-day retreats? You couldn't wait for, 1 week later? Now? But now is the time. That was the truth. I didn't ask for it. It happened. So all these things are happening to the mind, and you're observing it. You're watching it. So don't be surprised, but you need to practice. Pick one. Kaya. Let's go with Kaya.
Buddha soldier.
concerns or questions, please don't hesitate to reach out to us at info@buddhadharmatv.com. Thank you for watching, and I am sure that our program on Buddha Dharma TV will be a source of inspiration for many of peace lovers around the globe. Good night.